Hello everyone, this is Aric Hall with the Blaze of Glory. Today I wanted to do a review of my thoughts on The Thrill of the Chase, the book. When I was younger, I had a granddad who, when he would open a new toy, it didn't matter if it was a children's toy or a brand new table saw. He would spend several hours trying to put it together, and then he would finally break down and read the instructions. Well, that's a little bit like me. I've spent 2 summers running around the Rocky Mountains looking for the Forrest Fenn treasure. And, altogether, I've probably been in the Rockies about 14 weeks over those 2 summers, and maybe half of that time devoted to treasure hunting. And now that I've come back home, I've decided it was time to read the instructions. I finally read The Thrill of the Chase. And so that's what this video is about, is me going through my thoughts of The Thrill of the Chase. Most of this is old news, and I'm not going to revisit everything. You've heard it all before, but I wanted to talk about some of the things that stood out to me. We know the cover of the dust jacket, it has that image that if you turn it upside down, it looks like the states, and the gold coins being in Montana. Well, that fits well for me, but of course there's clues throughout that book that lead us all over the world. We know on the dust jacket it tells us that clues are scattered throughout the book. And it's about Yellowstone and Central Texas and Vietnam and other places that Forrest Fenn has been. So we don't know what clues we're supposed to be looking for. On page 4, he says, "My church is in the mountains and along the river bottoms where dreams and fantasies alike go to play." Well, we know that he's liked fishing everywhere he's lived. Page 6, Eric Sloane said he was going to write one more book entitled 80 and then die. And that's what he did. Apparently he dropped dead in New York, walking to a luncheon that was going to honor him for his new book entitled 80, An American Souvenir. And we know that Forrest Fenn was motivated by that when he decided the time to hide his treasure chest. On page 41, there's a sketch and a story of Forrest Fenn sitting on a headstone in a graveyard in Temple, staring at the stars. And he says a kid really has time to think in a graveyard. Hey, have you ever gone courting in a cemetery dead at night? You might get arrested today. On page 45, the title is In Love with Yellowstone. Okay, well, we know that's one of the many places that were either special to him or where his heart is. He's given us a number of those in other writings and interviews. I think from page 45 to 50, he talks about that 50-mile detour down a dirt road in Wyoming to look at the sign, "Whoso teaches a child labors with God in his workshop." It would be nice to know where that school was. On page 47 to 48, he talks of Canyon Street and refers that to the deep white canyons in his hand. Maybe that's a reference to being old, being tired, and now I'm weak. He also references the brown gravy at Totem, and now he can't stand it because he saw too much brown gravy at the Totem Cafe. I would be hard-pressed to believe that that's the home of Brown unless you believe the Totem Cafe is the home of Brown. On page 48, he stole a pie from the Totem Cafe. And I'm starting to notice this trend in Forrest Fenn's life about his criminal enterprise. I'm going to do a video on that later, but I digress. He tells us on page 87 to 88 the story of pilots stealing pepper for survival. So they were requisitioning free stuff from the mess hall. Page 57, he bribed 2 Mexican officials to get Skippy's body back from Mexico. I'm starting to see a pattern in Forrest Fenn's life, but I don't think that helps us with the treasure unless he stole it too. But I digress. Page 57, scratch that. Page 59, the mention of Osborne Russell and the encounter with Blackfeet Indians at the Madison River near today's Hebgen Dam. Now, he said that Osborne Russell escaped to Stinking Creek. and it was Stinking Creek to the west. The only Stinking Creek I know of in that region is what is today called the South Fork Shoshone River, which is southwest of Cody. Now that's to the east of Lake Hebgen by many miles, and it's on the other side of Yellowstone and another, I don't know, 30 or 40 miles past that. It stands out to me as a factual inaccuracy. I've looked at some of the older maps around that region. I have found no place that was previously labeled Stinking Creek. On page 138, when he says, "It only matters who they think you are." Is this an insight into the mind of the deceiver, Forrest Fenn? Page 60 and 61 is the story of Red Canyon, where he and Donnie Heath took a map with them. They went on horseback. They eventually burned the map to light a fire. He said hunger was no longer just a theory. They ended up coming out of the mountains there 50 miles away from where they started. I went into Red Canyon. Of course, I only went into the south end of that. I didn't wander for 50 miles. On page 62, Donnie said that famous quote when they were trying to get out of those mountains, "If we don't change course soon, we'll end up where we're going." I don't know of any place in there that has a creek or river that comes out in a narrow canyon that you can't walk out of that same canyon. There may be one, especially if they went 50 miles, but in my 2 summers in that region, I haven't seen such a thing, and I don't see it, on the map, on Google Earth. Well, let's see, page 65, Forrest mentions sage and pine, 7 miles west of West Yellowstone. This was when they were chasing the buffalo that they named Cody. Now, 7 miles west of West Yellowstone is where those 2 KOA campgrounds are. I have spent a whole lot of time out there. Yeah, it doesn't really fit that description of sage and pine. Yeah, there are places there where you see sage and then it gives way to pine going up the mountainside. Something about that geographic description, it didn't fit right to me just based on what I've seen. But maybe that's just my observation. Anyway, the buffalo that was named Cody was supposedly shot and served at the Stagecoach Inn, and apparently that upset Forrest Fenn. Page 71 is where we read about this threshold moment. In all of the life stories that Forrest Fenn has, it was after he got kicked out of A&M where he was not actually enrolled, and he went and laid down and went to sleep under a pine tree. He told some guy in a pickup truck his sad story, and the guy turned around and left him there. This was not the only time Forrest Fenn was left standing on the side of the road. Remember the other one when Skippy left him on the side of the road near Shoshone, Wyoming. But the thing that caught my attention in this story about sleeping under the pine tree was when Forrest Fenn had made a comment about going out in the woods and sitting down and dying underneath the pine tree and becoming fertilizer for that tree. Page 80. This is where we start getting into numbers. I've talked about the number 300 before. I know there's other numbers that other searchers have latched on to. On page 80, we read about a 100-foot waterfall in Vietnam, and then a 300-foot high trees in Vietnam. Now, I have a problem here. There are 300-foot high trees on this earth, but I have not found any reference to them in Vietnam. We know the California redwoods can get over 300 feet. I believe there's a tree in Australia, but I am not aware of any such thing in Vietnam. Now, if you know of one, by all means, leave a comment in this video. Let me know about it, because I put that with my notes here. But he mentions these 300-foot high trees twice. It's on page 80 and page 89. On page 89, he also mentions other numbers when he was flying at 200 feet at 500 knots. We've seen those numbers before. People have been within 500 feet of the treasure and searchers within 200 feet. And here we have 200 feet and 500 knots. The difference between 200 and 500 is 300. I keep seeing that number. Page 91, he mentions a 300-foot wide clearing of trees. And as a side note, in the book Too Far to Walk, on page, I think it's on 123, he talks about himself being 300 feet from the waters of the South China Sea. And we know he's given those non-clues about the treasure being 300 miles west of Toledo, 300 miles southwest of Toledo. And if you recall from one of my videos this summer, when I was in one of my search spots, I found this object with the number 300 on it. And that is still my favorite search area. I cannot stand that. I want to go back there to my 300. Let's see, what else did I have here? Page 89, he defines animals as including humans. Well, that might be relevant because he said that where the chest is, he can see animals. Was it buffalo? Was it people? That might be something to consider if you think, when he goes in there with his treasures bold, he might have been going to a place that was within line of sight of animals, the two-legged, bipedal types of animals, humans. Page 101 and 102, he references Shakespeare and Longfellow, talking about how we're on this earth temporarily and we will be forgotten, that we are nothing more but footprints in the sands of time, and when we exit the stage, somebody else will take the stage, and then after a while they leave. The stage will be there for eons of time, but we won't. That was a segue to page 103, where he talks about his purpose in life, and either you enrich others or you've wasted your turn. I have a thought about this. I think I mentioned it a couple of places in my notes here. When you go out and look up at the stars at night, whether it's him sitting on somebody's gravestone at the cemetery and temple, or if you're out in the mountains on a cool winter's night, you go out there far away from light pollution, look up at the sky and see how many stars there are and remind yourself of just how irrelevant you are. On page 116, when he tells the story about going out to Taos Mountain, he mentions juniper and sage. Now, I know that juniper is nothing like a pine tree, but I think of that because of his references earlier to pine and sage and telling us where the treasure there is pine and sage. On page 121, we run into another problem of factual inaccuracies that I see in this book. He claims that he was in Yellowstone in the summer until the leaves turned yellow before going back to Texas to school. Now, I've been in Yellowstone in late August, obviously, and I didn't see anything turning yellow. And the Fenn family used to take several days or more, because they were driving 35 miles per hour. It took them a long time to get to Texas. If they left when the trees were turning yellow, they wouldn't have got back till October. Did a school in Central Texas not start till October? There's something about that story that leaves me feeling that we have some erroneous information here. On page 124, he has a reference to one of his secret fishing holes where he fished under the tutelage of his dad and where he would later guide other fishermen. Now, he could have fished with his dad in Central Texas or in Yellowstone, but he was a fishing guide somewhere around West Yellowstone, presumably the Madison or Gallatin rivers, most likely. He was, as far as we know, he was never a fishing guide in Central Texas, and since he mentions the book Flywater, that was stories about fishing places in the West, not in Central Texas. On page 125, he uses the phrase, "the waters were mine alone." Now, that word alone you've seen before in the first stanza. I have gone alone in there. I keep thinking that his secret place, his special place, I know there's many special places to Forrest Fenn, but it would lead me to believe that the treasure is probably going to be in one of these secret special fishing places. And here in 125, he is lamenting the fact that it's not lonely anymore out there. There's too many fishermen there. And he says, how dare they invade my special private place? He has said the same thing about Slough Creek up in northern Yellowstone, where it used to be a secret fishing place. Of course, Forrest Fenn probably had a lot of these secret places that were his alone. But there was something else on this alone reference. He talks about his fishing place that was mine alone, and he mentions cobalt blue water. Now, I hate that. There is nowhere in my search areas have I seen cobalt blue water. I have seen references from other people describing the high mountain lakes, such as those in the mountains of Colorado, as being cobalt blue. There are a lot of lakes, even Lake Hebgen, if you're looking across it from the distance, it looks blue. But if you go out there and stand on the edge of the shoreline and you get your feet wet, it doesn't look blue up close. The only two places I have been that I have seen blue water was at the end of Rock Creek out at Earthquake Lake, where the water is dammed up by the road. There is a blue translucent pool. The other was at the headwaters of the Green River, just below Gannett Peak and the Wind River Range in Montana. But that is both of those are a light blue. It's that glacial snowmelt blue color. It's kind of a light putrid blue. I certainly would not describe either one of those as cobalt blue. I am really curious where cobalt blue water might be found that is some sort of a fishing river. For those of you who live and search in other places, leave me a comment below and tell me where you might think cobalt blue fishing waters are, because I think that might help us. I mean, granted, he's not telling us the treasure chest is at that place, but it was one of his special fishing places. Okay, page 129. He uses the word secret, but he uses it as the verb secrete. He talks about secreting the treasure chest. This gets back to that dual use of words and Forrest playing with words and telling us words have multiple meanings, and Lord knows what he meant in the poem. Let's see, page 131 and 132. This is where we have that confusion about when he wrote the poem, because he says at almost 80. Is he talking about when Eric Sloane was almost 80 or when Forrest Fenn was almost 80? No matter what, I think this does not mesh with the story we've been given about writing the poem when he had cancer and 15 years to write the poem and then hiding the chest. There's something about that that does not seem congruent. It's like something there seems it has to be factually inaccurate. But the text here reads, if you read that chapter in sequence, it reads like he wrote the poem after he closed the lid on the chest. What, did he write the poem when he was 80? Like Eric Sloane writing a book at 80? But in that case, it would have been after he hid the chest. There's something about that still bothers me. The whole story of writing the poem when he had cancer, if he thought he was going to die, the treasure wouldn't have been hid and the poem wouldn't have been written at the time. But yet he tells us he decided to hide the treasure after the cancer. But yet he originally wrote the poem supposedly to say, leave my bones. And then he changed that because he survived. I don't know. That's something that still drives me bananas as to the time frame. On page 133, this is right after the poem. There's two things on that page right after the poem that lead us to nothing but confusion. He refers to the story of Captain Kidd and Gardiner's Island. Gardiner with an I is how the town in Montana, at Paradise Valley, the Yellowstone River, just north of Yellowstone, it's spelled with an I. They misspelled the name of that town. It was supposed to be Gardiner with E's, no I's. And they misspelled it, and they just decided to keep their town misspelled, and it still is to this day. So is this a reference to Gardiner, Montana? But on that same page, the page after the poem, that's where we see that grayed out image of the map, which is supposed to be the old 100-and-some-odd-year-old map of New Mexico. So you have a clue here referring to New Mexico and one to Montana. Is he just playing with our minds? That would be my guess. On page 135, Forrest laments that New Mexico will soon be covered with houses. This is one of those references to New Mexico and how he, in his reverie, laments the fact that there's population growth. Someday somebody might be building a house on his treasure chest. Page 136, Forrest Fenn uses this quote, "On solid rock, the ugly houses stand." This sounds like a Bible verse, a favorite among geologists. It was the foolish man who built his house upon the sand. But that's what Forrest says he wants. He wants his shining palace built upon the sands. He wants it to wash away, apparently. This is a side story. When I lived in Alaska, Governor Wally Hickel, back in the 1964 Good Friday earthquake in Alaska, he said he didn't want to rebuild the city of Anchorage with proper earthquake-resistant materials. He said that the next time the big one hits, he wants all the buildings to fall down so that there will be plenty of construction jobs after the earthquake, because we'll have to rebuild the whole town again. Apparently he didn't care that thousands of people would be dead in the process. But here Forrest is telling us he wants to build his house on the sand. I guess he's okay with rebuilding on a regular basis. Page 138, we're told the bronze bells are 3 feet deep, so metal detectors can't find them. But elsewhere, Forrest has told us a metal detector might help if we were standing on top of our treasure chest. I can't help but wonder, I still go back to some of his original quotes that he may have buried the treasure, because early on that's what he said. I know now he denies that. Page 138 and 139, he talks about the bronze bells and jars he's burying, where he misspells the word dollar with ER. He uses that quote, imagination is more important than knowledge. He also quoted that quote, attributing it to Einstein back on page 14. And again, he tells us his little line, it doesn't matter who you are, it only matters who they think you are. I'm sure Forrest has some higher meaning in those quotes. Why he put those on his bronze objects he was burying, it loses me. And page 147 is where he does the anagram, misspelling butterfly as flutterby. Again, playing with words and our minds. And here he says that he hopes that his life is only a rough draft of the place just ahead. Well, I'm sorry, Forrest, you've only got one chance here. Well, that's the end of my summation of this book. Does it make you wonder why they used to have book burnings out on the town square? I feel like the guy over at It Is What It Is Productions, the YouTube channel, where he says the books are only creating confusion. I don't see anything in this book that gets us closer to the treasure. It's his life story, all the places he's been, references to some of his special spots, but after that, I just don't see clues here. Well, anyway, that's my 2 cents. Remember to click, like, share, and subscribe.